I want us to become brothers again like we used to be, and for us to find ourselves and bond with each other. Can we agree to that?
Opinions vary.
Welcome to Three Brothers Filmcast. I'm Anton Bergstrom, and I'm here with my brothers,
Anders
and Aaron.
My last name is the same as my brother's.
And this month we're going to look back at the films of Val Kilmer, who recently passed away at the age of 65 on April 1st, 2025. But before we get started, could I please ask you to give us a quick rating for the podcast, or maybe even write a couple sentences as a review? If you haven't subscribed to our YouTube channel, please do so. We are an independent podcast and you are our marketing, so we would really appreciate it if you could rate, review, subscribe, or share the podcast with someone you know. Thank you so much. And now, on with the show.
And here we go.
Val Kilmer has, I think, a wider range of talents than his success ever really indicated. Yes, he achieved leading man status in the 1990s. Yes, he got to play Batman in Batman Forever, which was one of the highest-grossing films of 1995. And yes, he is still admired for a string of memorable supporting performances, from Iceman in the Top Gun movies to Doc Holliday in Tombstone to Gay Perry in 2005's Kiss Kiss Bang Bang. However, in my view, his work as the swordsman in Willow is still underappreciated. His work as Jim Morrison in The Doors should be more widely recognized as a formative influence on all subsequent biopics, especially the artist biopic. And perhaps most controversially, I think he's a pretty good Batman.
Okay, Ramblers, let's get rambling.
Aaron and I also have some actor comparisons we'd like to get into later in the podcast. But before we discuss Kilmer's performances in depth, I want to get us on record with some brief responses. So I got 5 questions here for you, or actually 4 maybe. First, so when you heard the news Kilmer had passed away on April 1st, which performance of his came to mind first? Whichever of you want to start that off.
I mean, I would probably say Batman from Batman Forever, which is, I think it's just that's the movie I've most engaged with him.
Yeah.
And I'm really fond of that movie. I loved it as a kid.
So it was for people to understand, it was a very key Bergstrom Brothers film of our childhoods. Mm-hmm.
And like I still like Batman Forever quite a bit, for different reasons than I like other Batman movies.
Yep.
But that's the one that comes to mind when I think of Val Kilmer, even though it's not particularly indicative of Val Kilmer as a performer. But be that as it may, that's the one that comes to mind.
Yeah. Anders, would it be Batman Forever too then?
Probably among the first couple, because as you say, it was a pretty key film when I was a young man. You know, I believe I dragged us all to go see it on my opening night of my 13th birthday. So it also might have been one of the first times we engaged with that sort of box office film. But the other film that, because I re-watched it in the last couple of years, and I think that his performance in it is often underrated and overshadowed by the other huge stars, is Chris Shirless in Heat. I think he's really awesome in that. And it's also partly because his performance is so... It really leaves a mark on that character to the point that, like, I last 2 summers ago I read Michael Mann's Heat 2, the sequel that prequel that he wrote to the film, and Shirless is like the primary character in the sequel elements. So, you know, there's a part of me that's kind of sad that we never got to have a Heat 2 with Kilmer in that sort of lead role of that film. But I mean, I could go on and on, but other sort of jump to my mind.
We'll get to the questions, but we'll get to the questions.
But yeah, that's probably the top 2.
I was kind of surprised that neither of you mentioned the movie that actually came to mind was Top Gun Maverick, because that's like his last performance, and there was, ever since I had seen that movie, there's sort of the lingering expectation that he's probably going to pass at some point. So I actually just sort of thought of him in that as, you know, old Iceman. So second question, maybe this is the same one. Is there a personal favorite performance by Val Kilmer, other than maybe the ones you mentioned?
I mean, are we all going to say the same one, that it's Tombstone, Doc Holliday?
Yeah.
I think
so.
He's just one of the great movie performances in that film,
Doc
right?
Holliday.
He's incredible. There's a verbal wit with the way that he handles that movie, which is kind of a relatively straightforward Western in a lot of ways, right? It's the gunfight of the OK Corral. It's been made as gunfight of the OK Corral, or Farewell
My Darling Clementine.
Oh, My Darling Clementine, sorry. Again, the song stuck in my head, but the old Henry Fonda movie. And yet, it's a very enjoyable movie. The cast is great. Bill Paxton, Sam Elliott, of course.
Kurt Russell.
Kurt
Russell as Wyatt Earp. That being said, Doc Holliday is the thing that you remember the most in it. He's the kind of tragic character. I don't want to quite say a jester within that film, but there's an element of him working on a different level in an almost Shakespearean sense, and so that's where you get Kilmer's theatrical roots come in, because he did come up as the youngest ever actor in Juilliard, and he's this classically trained stage actor coming up through the American circuit. And it's like, who is this young, extremely talented guy? And then he works his way into movies. Weirdly enough, in movies like Top Secret and Real Genius, which are not really highbrow in any way, shape, or form, right? But then he shows up in things like Willow, and he shows his range. But maybe, and obviously Top Gun, right, in the 80s. But Tombstone is the one where you can kind of glimpse the actor that Val Kilmer was meant to be in the movies, and yet somehow, even now that we have the totality of his career, was never almost allowed to be.
Yeah. I think that's a really important point, and maybe it's something we get back into when you guys do your actor comparisons, because I think that had Kilmer come up in a different era of Hollywood, his career and some of the films that he could have been in, as demonstrated in films like Tombstone, might have been a little bit different. Personal favorite is probably, for me, either Tombstone or... Like I said, I really like Heat. I think he's underrated in that film. But the other film that you mentioned that I actually have gained a greater appreciation of over the years, especially watching it with my boys, is Top Secret, which I think is one of the better Zucker Brothers sort of parodies of the era.
I've actually never seen it.
You really should, because it's both a parody of like classic spy and war movies, like Casablanca and things like that. But it's also a parody of kind of the Elvis like films, right, where they're singing and dancing, and he's kind of an Elvis figure in it, which is kind of interesting as well. So I think it demonstrates, even though it's a comedic role in a very broadly slapsticky, Naked Gun airplane type movie, it demonstrates his range and acting.
Yeah, I would also say Doc Holliday too. He's so good in that performance. You're right, Aaron, he is a bit of the jester, because he can sort of speak truth to the other authority figures and sort of operates kind of in his own space in it. But it's a great performance. Okay, which is the most underrated or underappreciated performance that you've seen by him? Like, what's something that you're like, I just wish more people gave it its due? I can go first.
It's weird with Val Kilmer, because I think a lot of the movies he was in are kind of subpar, even if I appreciate what he's doing in them. There's a lot of movies in the 90s and 2000s that are just kind of forgettable, mid-range thrillers or action movies or, whatnot. There's a movie like Ghosts in the Darkness, which is the African movie of him and Michael Douglas hunting these two man-eating lions in Tsavo in Kenya. He plays this Irish doctor who's also happens to be like a brilliant brilliant at building things. It's the idea that he's going to create a trap to get these lions. And his performance is very earnest. He's playing the straight man, which... to allow Michael Douglas the room to be this like wild, great hunter character who's actually not in it that much. The movie overall is not great, but it's enjoyable in that kind of forgettable 90s way. It's very much a movie when you watch it. But I don't know if I would go to and say, oh, Kilmer's like really underrated in that movie. I, weirdly enough, since he died, I've been thinking a lot about 2011 when we saw Francis Ford Coppola's Twixt.
Yeah.
Because
and we got to see him on stage.
And we saw him and Coppola there, and you could get Kilmer's wit, especially in the Q&A. And he was really comfortable on stage, because there's the same time he was doing Citizen Twain, playing Mark Twain on stage, and he was really getting back into his theatrical roots. And Twixt is one of those late Coppola experimentations. If you don't know what it's about, it's basically about a small town writer, or like a thriller mystery writer who goes to a small town to solve a mystery and kind of gets embedded in the history of Edgar Allan Poe and this ghost played by Elle Fanning that is interacting with him. But a lot of the movie is him on like Skype calls with his agent making jokes and doing Marlon Brando impersonations and being really goofy and kind of, again, the verbal dexterity comes out a lot. So it's a movie that maybe I wouldn't even like the movie if I watched it again. I thought it was like okay at the time, and I think it was a bit of that Brett Tiff. So I'm excited about seeing Coppola, seeing Kilmer and stuff in person. It was the early years still there. That said, I still think like Kilmer's interesting in the movie, and I kind of want people to just go watch it so you can see a later Kilmer movie where he's not just nameless bad guy killer villain thing.
That is a really good choice for like sort of an out there performance in a film that probably people haven't seen. Good, that's a good choice. Anders?
I'll go with something that's more, I don't think the film itself is underrated, at least I think it's very good. I think it's very well regarded, but I think that his voice work in Prince of Egypt is underrated. I actually really
as
like
Moses.
as Moses.
And God.
And a God, because, right, when God speaks through the burning bush, it's also Moses' own, voice coming back at him in that, which I think is a really interesting sort of touch. But Kilmer actually just the textures, it allows you to focus on the texture of his voice. Like his voice, I can hear it in my head very easily, right? He has it's kind of melodious, lower tone but not deep, and it has a character to it, and he really sells, I think, Moses' sort of transformation in that story, and especially the way that DreamWorks decides to tell it in that film, which I think is probably one of the best, animated films of the 90s.
Yeah. You know what? I like that. Speaking about his voice actually gets me thinking about something in Batman Forever, which is the way that was the first movie, like as a kid, where I started to think about how Batman Bruce Wayne like speaks in different ways, because Val Kilmer really does a different thing with his voice, which Christian Bale would take to a whole nother level in Batman Begins, but
he's not doing the whole like completely like ridiculous. It's like he changes it without making it.
But he
silly.
He goes into like that his lower range for Batman.
Can I persuade you to take a sandwich with you, sir?
I'll get drive-through.
Because like when I was watching The Doors for the first time the other night, I noticed when he's speaking and he's younger, but he's also sort of like, hey guys, and he's like, it was much more sort of like higher toned a lot of the time when he's just casually speaking with his friends. And his Bruce Wayne is more like that, and then his Batman. But it just shows that, like, he had a career on stage too. He clearly was someone who really had a developed range to his voice. And I think you're right that in terms of voice work in an animated movie where it's not a comedic performance, like that is a great example of strong voice work really adding to that film.
So it's an interesting thing because that movie was one of those late 90s when the shift to name actors starts taking over animation,
kind of
in a
after
way that
Toy
it
Story,
hadn't before, right? Because like it's around the same time, I think just the year prior is Hunchback of Notre Dame,
Yeah.
right? Which has Tom Hulce in the lead role, who is best known for Amadeus. Also a very good movie, actually. But after Prince of Egypt comes out and DreamWorks kind of really pushes beyond the like sort of Robin Williams type roles of having like every role is stacked, right? But Kilmer doesn't dominate the role in making it like people are just here to hear Val Kilmer's voice. Like he allows himself to disappear into that role in a way that, I think is rare to see in voice acting from either stage or like people who mostly do live action films.
It's a real vocal performance. It's not a celebrity performance.
Correct. Yeah.
No, good point.
In a way that even within that film, it has a few celebrity performances. Like I would say that Jeff Goldblum's Aaron is more of a celebrity performance, right?
Moses.
Moses. Yeah. I wouldn't want to belabor it, but if some people may remember that movie fondly and may have forgotten until we're talking about it now that it's Val Kilmer in the lead role as Moses, right? That's the kind of role it is.
Definitely. So the other performance that was in my mind when I learned that he had passed, but also which I think is underappreciated, is his role in Willow as Mad Mardigan, as sort of the swashbuckling adventurer rogue who is both sort of a comedic figure but also a heroic figure. And when I've been rewatching this movie with my boys who really like the movie, I just find it's a great performance. I'm going to come back to it later when we talk about comparisons to other actors. Okay, last question. Aaron, speaking to your idea of the mid-level thriller aspects of his career, which is your favorite performance by Val in a mid-level thriller? So as much as I admire the guy, he definitely was from the late 90s through the 2000s in quite a few of these. Is there one where you're like, it stands out and it's definitely worth checking out, even if it's the whole movie's?
I mean, this is kind of tricky because I actually think a lot of the movies are forgettable. And this might not fit the bill of a mid-level thriller so much. I guess it's technically a genre movie and it's technically in the 2000s, but the movie that I'm thinking of is Port of Call, New Orleans, the Bad Lieutenant movie that Werner Herzog made with Nick Cage, where Val Kilmer is the other partner. And it's Val Kilmer very much in this mode because he's playing a cop. He's playing this kind of forgettable side supporting character. He's not quite on the level of Nick Cage in it, though he is heightened. The movie's pretty deranged if you've seen it.
But he's not Nick Cage deranged in that movie.
Yeah, he's not hiding behind a door, dry shaving, and then strangling an old woman using her breather tube through her nose and just completely going nuts. But yeah, there's something about Kilmer having fun in this movie. Again, it's been a long time since I saw it. It's not like a particularly important Val Kilmer role in any way, shape, or form. It's just, hey, it's Val Kilmer in a decent movie that might scratch the itch if you want to watch a cop movie from the 2000s.
Yeah, Anders?
I haven't seen it in probably more than 20 years, but to me, the movie that exemplifies that late 90s Kilmer role, kind of post Batman when they're trying to, they're kind of positioning him as a star, but it's definitely, to me, a mid-level thriller is The Saint. Right? Yeah. His Simon Templar, the remake of the old TV show with Roger Moore. But yeah, to me, that's sort of that kind of Val Kilmer trying his hand at being a, action star.
It was definitely made in the wake of Mission Impossible, right?
Yeah,
sort of
definitely.
Cash in
it came
on
with the year after.
These reboots of the older spy shows.
Yep.
Yeah.
So maybe it has
that
more to do with this Phantom or the Avengers than Mission Impossible in terms of the type of movie it is.
Yeah, in its actual thing. But I think that the marketing and what they were trying to do is more like Mission Impossible and trying to have it be a star vehicle in the way that Mission Impossible was a Tom Cruise star vehicle, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So, but, I'll let you, Anton, do you have one that you want
to? I would just say, David Mamet made a movie called Spartan in 2004. And Kilmer just plays, it's just one of these movies where it's it's not an exceptional performance and it's not an exceptional movie, but it's actually worth checking out. And I remember Kilmer in it. And I would also just point to, I watched Deja Vu, Tony Scott's movie. And again, Kilmer's not the main character. It's a Denzel Washington movie. But Kilmer is sort of a supporting character, one of the cops, or I think FBI. But again, he at that stage, it's it's the mid-2000s, and he's a little bit older, so he sort of just steps super comfortably into sort of the role of I'm running the show as the cop guy. So again, that movie overall is actually definitely worth checking out.
I agree.
You had your whole life to prepare for this moment. Why aren't you ready?
I'm tired, sir.
Do you wish to quit? If your mission is to quit, there's no better time than right now. You can quit now. Get it over with.
I can't catch her.
I understand. Just take those numbers off and put them in my hand.
Okay, now, I'd envisioned these as more rapid fire, but, it's the three brothers. It's hard for us to do rapid fire answers. But I just thought we would maybe go back and... I actually haven't seen his earlier sort of comedic stuff, but Anders, you talked a bit about Top Secret. And I was just wondering, how do you see that sort of setting the stage for what came later before we sort of get into some of his wherever we want to go with this, some of his hits, whatever.
I think, to reiterate a couple of the things I said, I think it's a film that shows his varied talent. Because even though it is a very broad, slapsticky, like farcical Zucker Brothers film, I think that his character has to kind of be earnest, and right, he's this sort of Elvis Presley type character who gets into this whole spy plot, like Cold War kind of thing, right? And so those kind of films really work with the lead actor kind of not winking too much at the audience, right? So, and I think it's a hard thing to pull off sometimes. So, I would compare it, say, to even like, to some extent, something like Leslie Nielsen in Naked Gun, right?
Yeah.
Like, you have to be self-serious in a funny way. And I think that he pulls that off in Top Secret very well. So it shows that he has to do some dancing. And the singing maybe points ahead to The Doors. I had never seen The Doors.
Yeah, you and I both, we watched it.
Revisited it.
Well, not I had never seen it, so I wasn't revisiting.
Yeah, or visited it for the first time. Went back and finally caught up with it, I should say.
What do you think about, Aaron, have you seen The Doors?
No, I haven't.
Okay.
But I think what's interesting is that he, not only that the fact that he does some of his own singing in it, right?
Yeah.
It sort of anticipates later the Ray and Walk the Line and Complete Unknown this past year and stuff like that. That idea of, sort of becoming the character in that way.
Yeah.
And I was a little bit surprised by that. I think that Kilmer's performance in that film is very good. Even if, I think the film's good. I don't think it's like a great film. It's not one of my favorite Stone films. But I do think it's good.
I think, like, when I was watching it, I found that The Doors seems more formative for the whole music biopic than I was aware until I finally saw it. And I think you've mentioned this aspect about the performance and the idea that you're going to, like, I'm going to try to, like, really sort of get into the actual performance of the artist. I'll do the singing myself to some extent, music, things like that. So I think the movie is, like, going back, you're like, it's significant in that sense that it's like the kind of movie where it's worth seeing for Kilmer's performance, definitely. I like it. I also think it, like, in some respects, because it's Stone, I like that it's a music biopic that isn't just kind of about, like, oh man, let's, like, relive the good times and, like, listen to the music we love. It's actually more sort of, like, I think trying to sort of capture what was happening in a culture at that time and how the man is sort of a symbol of something.
I think it's hard to disentangle Jim Morrison and from the film itself, right?
Yeah. Well, it's only like 20 years after he dies, 91 to 1971.
And frankly, Morrison is borderline insufferable.
Okay, one we have to mention, because we didn't really discuss that much, but the original Top Gun.
Yeah.
Thoughts about Kilmer? My first instinct is that when I think about it, you're like... Because I sort of say that, like, a lot of people, I feel like most people our age, at least, remember who Val Kilmer is and could point out a number of movies they've seen him in. But I also feel like he never achieved sort of the mega stardom he potentially could have had, both for his looks, his performance ability, all sorts of things. And to me, Top Gun's interesting because it's like him versus Tom Cruise, and one of these guys goes on to be the mega star, and the other guy's sort of never quite on that level. But anything else about Top Gun?
Well, I would just say, though, that clearly, though, Val Kilmer is the second lead of the film in terms of, like, memorableness and becoming a star, right? Whatever Goose, I mean, he has a big cast, right? Goose, Viper, Jester, everybody, but Iceman is, like, the other big, character in the film that people remember, I think.
Yeah, I find, I always think with the original Top Gun, which I actually don't like as much as Maverick, but I always think
Agreed.
Josh Larson, the critic and Film Spotting co-host, his comment about how the original Top Gun, Iceman's the actual hero of the movie, not Maverick. Like, Iceman is the reason things turn out in the end, and Maverick, they kind of get away with his him playing the things his way, and that's an interesting way to read the movie because Iceman is the antagonistic character. He's the by-the-book guy, but he's a bit of the hard ass and a bit of the badass, and he doesn't have the carefree nature of Maverick, so we're not drawn to him in that way, but in a sense, he's actually more mysterious and almost alluring because he is such a, like, disciplinarian in a sense. It's like there's a respect that comes into his approach to his work, and it's interesting comparing Cruise and Kilmer in Top Gun. I think largely because Cruise is even though he's a very talented actor, Cruise is always Cruise in film.
Always.
He bends the films towards his own persona and his own mystique, and in a sense his own ego. And I don't mean that in a critical sense. I just mean it in a descriptive sense that Tom Cruise is a movie star in the true sense of he has a cinematic ego that is like larger than life. And I don't think Val Kilmer is a movie star in that sense. Even though he might have, it sounds like he was a very mercurial, prideful actor and difficult on a lot of sets.
A lot of tensions with directors over the years.
That said, he doesn't project as an egotistical actor in the performances. If anything, he seems actually to be the true psycho actor who is all about like disappearing into the role to a point where it almost might be bad for him as a career. So you take Iceman, and he is willing to be the stick up his ass, hard ass, to a point that it actually makes you root against him, even though when you think about it in a logical sense, you're like, there's nothing this guy's doing that's wrong.
Right.
He's just trying to run a safe mission, guys.
The name of the characters too, right? Like,
yeah.
Maverick has to be the...
Yeah, Iceman versus Maverick.
And Iceman is cool. He's focused.
Yeah.
He's...
But like, let's be... I don't know, Anta, like, what do you think about this? Because thinking back about Top Gun, I like the movie. It's a very Tony Scott movie. It's got great music. It's very iconic. I think as a movie, it's like good. And that's kind of it.
Yeah.
And I think it's almost made better in retrospect because of its relationship to Maverick and how that conception of American culture and the American action movie, and specifically action war movie, is connected between our differences of the 80s and differences of the 2020s. But all that said, if I look back at Top Gun, the thing I like about the movie is not the Tom Cruise performance. Like, I actually think Val Kilmer is probably my favorite part of the movie, aside from the Fault in My Ear music.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And just the Tony Scott sheen.
Yeah, the sheen. But like, I don't think Cruise's performance is actually like all that memorable, aside from him with the aviators and smirking. Like,
yes.
As a performance, it's kind of more a signifier than an actual performance. Well, Kilmer's the one where I'm like, well, I got Cruise. The Cruise experiences in Maverick that's personified in such a perfect way. The Kilmer experience is kind of personified in Iceman.
Yeah. I would agree.
It also makes sense that Iceman goes on to become,
the Admiral.
He becomes the Admiral. Totally. But I agree. I truly believe that Top Gun Maverick is a much superior film, and I think the layer of sort of meta referential quality to it makes it a stronger blockbuster, and but it also in turn like makes the original more significant. Because the original, like when I watched it, it's fun, but I never
goofy.
loved it when I saw it back in the day. To be honest,
it's never been my favorite Tony Scott film.
No, even I probably like Deja Vu better.
You guys really are cowboys.
What's your problem, Kazansky? You're everyone's problem. That's because every time you go up in the air, you're unsafe. I don't like you because you're dangerous.
That's right. Nice, man. I am dangerous.
So, thinking about, like, you're sort of talking about Kilmer as a director, as an actor who, even if on set he could be antagonistic with director, maybe not antagonistic, but he could have troubles with directors. But he definitely doesn't sort of draw everything to himself on screen. I think Batman Forever is actually a really interesting example of that too, because it's like, it's the movie that kicks off the problem that eventually exploded in Batman and Robin, where it's like there's too many villains and the villains overshadow everything, and we're not even having Batman in this movie. But there's something like gracious about like Kilmer's performance in that, where
I would agree.
He holds the film together by playing it as like the straight man, because even we forget, like, I feel like sometimes people forget that in the original Batman, like Batman, like Bruce Wayne is kind of like a Peter Parker weirdo loner guy.
Yeah, Keaton plays him as an oddball,
Yeah.
and I've been rewatching the animated series just as like a time for I just love that show, so I'm just throwing on episodes here or there.
So good.
And something that the animated series does, and I think Kilmer does this, and then Bale does this, and it's the correct Batman take, is that like Batman doesn't have a great sense of humor.
Yeah.
No.
That's kind of part of it. He's a guy who takes things so deadly seriously. So there's a lot of moments in the animated series where a character will make a joke, specifically Robin will, and Batman like doesn't get it, or it just like he's not impressed and he just moves on, and he's kind of a killjoy in that sense, right?
Well, yeah, it's exemplified by the line in the very first episode of the Christmas with the Joker. Bruce, you've never seen It's Wonderful Life? I can never get past the title.
Yeah. And Kilmer has a bit of that, especially with his exasperation across the screen from Jim Carrey in a different way than Tommy Lee Jones. Like Tommy Lee Jones hated Jim Carrey apparently on set and thought it was, and you can kind of see how annoyed his Two-Face is by Riddler, both in being upstaged and so they're kind of fighting each other to see who's actually the more outlandish. But you get it in the scenes of, I'm specifically thinking of the scene in which Nigma reintroduces himself as this magnet, and there's the party, and it's like, Bruce,
gala.
you must meet Edward Nigma.
And he's dressed up
Gala,
exactly
and he's literally
like...
dressed with the same haircut, same suit, everything.
Yeah, and the way that Kilmer's playing it across is there's this kind of he's allowing Carrey the space to be within that scene relatively contained craziness, but there's still the craziness within the way he engages with stuff. There's an oddball comic energy, and Kilmer is almost annoyed that Carrey is not working on a like dramatic wavelength in which you can tell that he's fighting a little bit, not in like a sense the performance that doesn't work. It's just he is trying to course correct into a more like respectable performance within the scenes, but it actually translates really well because he's sickened by Nigma's presentation as a like tech magnet or billionaire or whatever in this scene. So that's just a perfect example of like Kilmer's using the scenario around the scene that might be frustrating to actually feel the very dynamic that is essential to the performance.
I love the detail in that scene where, again, it's actually a great little maneuver of like the acting in a ridiculous movie in a lot of respects. But you're like the way that Bruce Wayne, like Kilmer's Bruce Wayne, takes off his glasses at one point, and then carries it. Nigma feels that he has to take off his glasses and fold them at the exact same time, and then Bruce like puts them back on, and there's like a weird sort of like game of like, are you gonna keep imitating me with even the way I hold my glasses? And so like it's a great little dynamic in the performances.
Yeah, Kilmer, like, could almost make this episode a Batman Forever episode, but the thing about Kilmer in that is that he also, like, it's been said some of that especially even Batman Returns, like I've done the thing where you time how long it takes Batman to show up in that movie, and he doesn't appear for at least 13 minutes on screen at all before not even saying anything for even longer. But at the same time, Keaton's Batman is an equally sick psycho, like, to the other characters, right? In a sense, there's a reason in the first one he said, want to get nuts, let's get nuts, right? But Kilmer dials him back into this sort of brooding, starts even within the campiness of Schumacher's vision. His Bruce Wayne is that brooding kind of guy, and he anchors the film in that way. He's kind of the straight man to everybody else.
One of the crazy things about watching the movie again after quite a long time was that the movie's like attempted range, and there's definitely a camp aspect of the film, but it veers from, it's like it's trying to capture all aspects of Batman, because there's certain flashback sequences it plays for Bruce Wayne where it seems that the movie actually is trying to have like some sort of like pathos happen, and then it also veers into insanity with Jim Carrey, and it's like it's trying to be like, we're just gonna do the whole range of Batman from like boy having trauma all the way up to crazy 1960s goofballs in tights.
So there is a reason for that. I did a little bit of more reading about the film, and part of the reason Kilmer didn't return with Schumacher was not that the studio wouldn't have had him back, because obviously Batman Forever was a success. It was his frustration with Schumacher's sort of turning of the focus of the film into the camp elements, and the butchering of the original script, apparently, that had a lot more stuff. Because like if you actually watch, it's a very short film. It's more, by modern standards, 2 hours. And packs a lot into those 2 hours. But as you say, there's these strange flashbacks. There's the Bruce is attempting to deal with some of his childhood trauma with Dr. Meridian, all the stuff around the dreams. There's things that are alluded to and then suddenly dropped. There's the weird bit where like Batman suddenly decides, I'm not going to be Batman anymore. It's like, is he doing that just to, annoy Robin, or is he actually serious that, and it's like there's a good like 20-minute chunk of the movie missing.
Yeah.
And there is. Essentially, there is. And Kilmer was very frustrated, apparently, with that. Because I think he wanted to dig into some of that, the meaty, dramatic elements of Batman in that way. So, yeah, I think it shows his willingness to take, comic books and stuff seriously.
Yeah.
So, going sort of chronologically through some of his films there, just one other small performance that sort of connects things in various ways. You can do these weird connections. Kilmer worked with certain directors a couple times, Oliver Stone, but also he has a small role in True Romance, which I rewatched a couple years ago.
Yeah. Who's in True Romance?
In True Romance, he plays the strange Elvis mentor, the sort of vision character Christian Slater's character has, right?
Huh.
It's Val Kilmer in that role. So, which again is kind of a throwback to his role in Top Secret as like this Elvis sort of character as well. So, these kind of, there's sort of these cycling features that he has, right? And then after, Tombstone, Batman Forever, Heat, those are three, pretty successful performances that then in 1996 he was in The Island of Dr. Moreau with...
which is part of the impetus for the Marlon Brando.
Yes, in Quicks.
Yes.
That's what I was going to say, yeah. So Island Dr. Moreau is also, I guess apparently back in the mid-'90s when I was in high school, I just went to see every Val Kilmer movie when it came out in theaters, because I also saw that one in theaters. It's a weird movie because it was originally a John Frankenheimer film that Frankenheimer... And then it was also working by a guy, Richard Stanley, who never made another film until he made the Lovecraft adaptation of The Color Out of Space with Nicolas Cage, just 2019, 2020.
Oh, wild.
But it's a weird movie, a weird adaptation of H.G. Wells's book. It's pretty demented. And again...
Who's Kilmer in it? He's like
Kilmer is in it.
Main,
he's the main character.
Okay,
Brando's Moreau.
Yeah, okay.
And Kilmer is
Montgomery, right?
Yeah.
I don't remember if I've seen that, to be honest.
I've seen bits because of the weird animation, and it's got Ron Perlman and stuff.
Yeah, it's got very the kind of like has like Island of Lost Souls like disturbing like animal effects.
I only remember the weird action figures that they put out a line of the.
But it has like David Thewlis and Tamara Morrison and some other people in it too, but like in weird like animal makeup. Fruza Balk's like the Catwoman, sort of from like, so it's sort of a Wells film, but it's also clearly indebted to Island of Lost Souls and stuff. So, which of course is a Wells adaptation as well. But
maybe speaking to
it's a weird movie.
Maybe speaking to like the range that Kilmer also displayed and sort of sought out in roles. I was looking through his filmography and I was thinking about a movie I hadn't seen since I saw it probably back in 2004, but it's from 2003. It's Wonderland. So it's one of these like the sordid side of Hollywood movies in LA, and he plays the porn star John Holmes. And it's one of these performances where he's like, it's like he's hairy and he's like getting overweight in the performance. And it's like the willingness to sort of do the range, to sort of do a certain character at different times, to explore, in this case, sort of the person's descent and depravity. But like, that's what I find interesting about Kilmer, is just that at the same time he has like leading man looks, and he, but he never only played into that. So maybe this would be a good point to bring up. I think Aaron and I have been bouncing around some points of comparison with other sort of actors that we've thought. Aaron, did you want to take the lead on that?
Yeah, and I actually have to apologize here because this is not an original thought. It's simply something I saw in the aftermath of Val Kilmer dying, in which somebody said Robert Pattinson is the Val Kilmer of right now. And it just clarified so much, I think, about the type of leading man that Kilmer was and wasn't allowed to be, in a sense, and a way that Pattinson is allowed these things.
And they're both Batman.
Yeah.
Well, of course, that's what I was going to say. Is the joke is that they both play Batman. And they're both kind of were introduced partially for their romantic appeal. And, as leading men, they're both classically trained. I don't know if Val Kilmer a musician at all in his off time? Because Pattinson is, but I know Kilmer had a lot of interest in music, obviously, even through his performances. So there's that musical side too. But it basically comes down to the fact that, very handsome leading men who play the leading man roles, but are actually more of character actors within their approach to things, because they're more specific about the voice, most of all.
Yep.
They love doing accents. I've never seen all the Saint Anders, but in The Saint, doesn't he do a bunch of different voices in that movie?
He does, not necessarily convincingly.
No, not convincingly, but he clearly loves doing voices.
Yeah.
And so I just saw Mickey 17, the Bong Joon-ho film, and Pattinson gives a slightly different voice to every single version of Mickey. Most of the movie, he's kind of this weird, squeaky Brooklyn-like voice guy, but then in other parts, he's like a little more... and it's just, he's doing all these weird voices throughout the movie, and then you see something like, him in Batman, and he's almost like growling the whole movie as his people say the Christian Bale Batman's angry. It's like, no, the Robert Pattinson Batman is like so angry throughout the entire film. He's like barely on the edge of rage, and that's kind of the whole thing, right? His vengeance is like his physically bringing out his vengeance on everybody. But then you take Pattinson in The Lost City of Zed, and he's like very buttoned up and has this like very proper academic accent, and then you get his like suave accent in Tenet, and then you get him. I didn't see the English language version of The Boy and the Heron, but he plays the Heron.
Yep.
in the adaptation, and like
reunites him in voices with Willem Dafoe,
and so he's got the voices thing too. But then like I'm thinking Kilmer, Kilmer likes, because he's theatrical, he likes doing the voices on stage. But then you also get his Irish accent and something, and then he's doing different parts of America. Then he's doing an Elvis voice, and then there's a I don't know, maybe I'm belaboring this too much, but there's like an old-fashioned, corny appreciation of theatricality and how that can be wielded within movies, even in blockbusters. But they're also very capable of straight men too. Like, Pattinson's not weird in every movie. He's actually very like conventional in a lot of movies, and he knows when to play it which way. And Kilmer was like that too, because he could be Doc Holliday and he could be Mad Mardigan, but he could also be Batman and Batman Forever, and he could also be in my why in my brain I'm like John Spartan in Spartan.
I wish that was his name.
That'd be pretty sweet if that was his name. But yeah, I think there's a something there, and there's other actors too probably that play into it. I don't know if either of you are going to comment on like a Johnny Depp.
That's what I was going to say.
Yes.
But I think that Depp is clarifying, because you could see Depp doing Tombstone and so some of those roles, but I don't know that Depp has often, especially later in his career, sort of post his work with Burton and Gilliam, ever really like returned to that sort of more conventional leading man role.
Yeah.
Because even when he tries to do something like The Tourist, it's like, no, you're still being goofy as heck, in that movie.
So that was my point of comparison. But so I would say, but specifically Depp in his Jack Sparrow mode. Like, let's set aside sort of the gothic
right.
Depp. Because here's what I see, and this is what I find very interesting about going back and watching Willow and Val Kilmer's Mad Mardigan. Because he's very much like a Jack Sparrow character. And what it is that he's the swashbuckling adventurer. He's actually pretty good at sword fighting and doing his adventuring, but he's played for both comedy, action, and sort of like his sex appeal. And it's the fact that he hits on all those three things. You're like, it's not often that you're like, the character's like, I have my sword and I'm going to do something in like Mad Mardigan, and then like slips on ice and falls down. Like, there's not often where a character will like do that. And that was one of the great things about sort of Jack Sparrow's sort of range that he's presented. And then at the same time that like the film's serious about like his sex appeal to Keira Knightley's character. And the fact that he actually at times is like good at fighting, even if he's not doing his slapstick stuff.
Yeah. It's like he's a drunken oaf, but his plan's actually brilliant when he needs to execute it.
Or Jack Sparrow's a brilliant guy who is undone by being a drunken oaf.
And to go one further, the way we meet Mad Mardigan is that he's up in a cage and he's hung up there. Mm-hmm. And his friend,
he's
when his friend rides by,
Yep.
he's like, curse you, Mad Mardigan, I hope you die. So he pisses off everyone around him because he's always up to his bad tendencies. And he's, again, how many times is Jack Sparrow, about to die, a movie starts off and he's, in prison or he has to escape from something. And so I'm curious, I haven't really read into this, but I was sort of curious to what extent, was there any thought of Mad Mardigan when they're developing a Jack Sparrow? But I also think, Doc Holliday is the other main one where I think of where it's like the performance is so flamboyant and potentially consumes the entire picture, even though that there's amazing other leads in the film. But you could just talk about Doc Holliday and Tombstone if you wanted to. And I feel the same way about, Depp's Jack Sparrow, where you're like, there's a lot of other good stuff going on in those Pirates movies, but we often just don't even think about them. Because there's this sort of, in the first movie, again, it's like he's sort of the lead, he's sort of the supporting. And I feel like, also in Tombstone, it's like, it's a Wyatt Earp's movie, but it keeps turning into Doc Holliday's movie.
Yeah. Tombstone, Doc Holliday, Kilmer's Doc Holliday definitely has, there's something about that character, right? Back in the My Darling Clementine, which I quite like that because I love Ford and Fonda, but it's Victor Mature, right? And he just, you can see Victor Mature actually could do those kind of roles back in the day too, right? His strange role as the sort of Turkish doctor in the Shanghai Jester, the von Sternberg film and stuff like that. He was one of those sort of proto-Depp character actors back in the 40s and stuff. And he was kind of a sex appeal kind of character too, right? That I think a lot of people back in the 40s and 50s have remembered him like that. So maybe casting Val Kilmer in that, it makes a little bit of sense. I think, and even The Doors, Jim Morrison's a little bit of that kind of character, right?
Yeah.
You have to have all those different aspects. You have to buy him as the tortured poet of, California, but also then becoming this drunk jerk.
Yeah, you're right.
And you're part of the tragedy of The Doors is, someone who shows flashes of brilliance, who kind of buys his own mythology and, ends up, and even self-consciously, as Anton, in your review say, kind of self-consciously fashions him as a tragic romantic poet figure, right? So, yeah, I think he's good at that. And that's why it's interesting also, you mentioned that in Twixt, then the connection would be Coppola, and then he'd previously worked with Kilmer, Kilmer had previously worked with Brando in Island of Dr. Moreau, which apparently Brando, it was one of those late roles where he was completely insufferable in it, and impossible to work with.
Oh, yeah.
The costumes and things he was doing is so bizarre. He's wearing a white sheet over his head and just going insane. But you can see Kilmer try to in later than through working with Coppola and stuff, forging that sort of connection too, because I think Brando is the prototype of that kind of the movie star as handsome actor who disappears into his role, right?
Yeah, no, it's true. And Brando starts out as the romantic, handsome,
and then he's putting cotton balls
man
in his cheeks for The Godfather, and
Huh. Yeah, I feel like that makes a lot of sense, honestly, because again, Kilmer is a method actor.
Mm-hmm.
Kilmer, we haven't mentioned that yet, right? But that's how he approached his roles. He would go super deep in, and honestly, Pattinson's actually similar. Pattinson does that too on modern sets. He doesn't again refer to as actor name if they're shooting that during this before the coming and leaving kind of thing. And so maybe there's just that actors nowadays aren't particularly theatrical for the most part. You get a Pattinson, you get a few other people like that, but they're not. Kilmer, the more distance we get from the 90s specifically, I think the more Kilmer seems like a actor of a past era.
Yep.
And so it's really sad how his health degenerated late in life, like his cancer and losing his voice, and then obviously like he dies of pneumonia as complications for all this, right? And how weak he was in his later years. And he kind of used, social media and stuff as a means of his voice, right? Because he was notoriously engaging in online, he would reply to people's things constantly about like, oh, Val Kilmer, I always heard he did this, and he would jump in and be like, well, actually, this is blah, 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 and he'd give like a whole story about it. And I think that's just his way of engaging with the world, but it seemed like Val Kilmer's story in Hollywood was already over. And it was in some ways, which does make Maverick such a touching send-off.
Yeah, it is really appropriate.
Yeah, I think there's few performances I've seen where it seems so clearly and consciously like a send-off performance, and the role's constructed in that way. And I appreciate the fact that they were able to bring him into and write him into Maverick and have that, because I think it also adds a lot to that film. So it's a good, as much as it is sad, his passing and the circumstances of it, you're like, it's nice to, it's a good way to sort of end your time on screen.
I think that what speaks to it is that we all, when we were talking about Top Gun, we all said, it's a good movie, not our favorite Tony Scott or Val Kilmer film, but those final scenes in Maverick managed to have a real pathos to them that I remember, it got to me, it worked emotionally in a way that you're like, I don't know, should it have worked that well? It did. So, I think that speaks to Kilmer as a performer.
The Navy needs Maverick. The kid needs Maverick. That's why I fought for you. That's why you're still here.
Thank you, guys, for everything.
Thanks for listening, and catch you next time.
Goodbye, Mr. Bond.
I bid you farewell.